Good evening and welcome to IKG's Wisdom Wednesday. I am your host and coordinator for this great lecture series, Ajua, and we are so happy to have you. For those who may be new, IKG is an organization founded here in Washington, D.C. by Anthony Browder in 1981 to share knowledge of African history and culture with the world. And as part of that mission, we have the IKG free monthly lecture series called Wisdom Wednesday, where we bring to you a variety of speakers to speak on different topics related to Black African history, culture, spirituality, finance, law, entertainment, all areas of people activity, all areas of our lives. We provide speakers who can provide valuable information in those areas that we can utilize to uplift ourselves, our families, our communities, and ultimately our people. And tonight is no different. So we are so happy that you are joining us. As always, we want to acknowledge the people, our family from all over the globe who checks in for our Wisdom Wednesdays. So we're going to do a city roll call. So please shout out where you're from so that we can acknowledge your wonderful energy. So peace and love to our family checking in from New York City, Union City, California, Copperas Cove, Texas. We have New Orleans, Louisiana in the house. Welcome. Upper Marlboro, Maryland. Welcome, welcome. Germantown, Maryland. Columbus, Ohio. DC, of course, is in the building. Atlanta, Georgia is in the building. Welcome, Atlanta. Nana Malaya says, Africa, DC, and Maryland. Happy spring. Yes, happy equinox, everyone. Happy equinox. Oh, we have Anchorage, Alaska checking in. Thank you. Chicago, welcome. Jackson, Mississippi. Brooklyn, New York. Inglewood, California. Phoenix, Arizona. San Francisco, California. Berkeley, California. Silver Spring, Maryland. Yes, keep it coming in. It's so wonderful just to know that we're checking in from all over. Norfolk, Virginia. Hey, welcome to tonight's program. So before we get started, I do want to announce that someone mentioned a spring. Yes, it is. And that means it is the Egypt on the Potomac field trip season. That season will begin. Our first trip will be April 6th, 2024. And I'm going to be placing in the chat a link where you can go to register and purchase a ticket for any of the field trips that we will be having this season. Egypt on the Potomac field trips is the opportunity to see how Egypt has been reinvented right here in Washington, D.C. By looking at many of the structures and the layout of Washington, D.C., we will learn how that layout replicates our ancient African Egyptian architecture, structures, and knowledge. So you do not want to miss the Egypt on the Potomac field trips. The season is now open and you can purchase tickets at the site that was just placed in the link, in the chat. A link was just placed in the chat. Also feel free to go to ikgculturalresourcecenter.com to learn more about IKG and our programming. So tonight, we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Shantella Sherman, who will be speaking on the miseducation of Black children using 3D eugenic theories. Dr. Sherman writes, in 2022, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor noted that, quote, if you're Black, you're more likely to be in an under-resourced K-12 school. You're more likely to be taught by teachers who are not as qualified as others, and you're more likely to be viewed as having less academic potential, unquote. Dr. Shantella Sherman's research notes that you are also more likely to be classified as violent, un-educatable, and a threat to the learning environment for both teachers and other students. Such classifications have permeated American school systems since their inception and are linked directly to eugenic theories of Black inferiority that pronounce Black children as inherently intellectually deficient. Using what eugenicists, psychologists, and social workers call the 3D classification of deviance, defective, delinquent, and dependent, Dr. Shantella Sherman shows how millions of Black children continue to be routed into vocational training, remedial classes, or subnormal institutions. Each sets the trajectory onto the school to prison pipeline, but begins with eugenic mental capacity or standardized test. The miseducation of Black children using 3D eugenic theories equips audiences with historical understanding, necessary context, and tools to challenge the current use of 3D classifications to assess Black children. A little bit about our speaker. Dr. Shantella Sherman is a historian and journalist whose work documents, deconstructs, and interprets eugenic themes in U.S. laws, social policies, and popular culture. She also examines how eugenic theories inform identity formation among African Americans, reproductive apartheid in carceral spaces, and housing and educational policies within marginalized communities. Dr. Sherman serves as public historian for the Acumen Group and publisher of Acumen Magazine, the nation's only student-led African-American quarterly magazine. She is a former editor for the Philadelphia Tribune and Washington Informer newspapers and Round Lake News Service. Dr. Sherman won 2 AAHGS awards for her books, In Search of Purity, Eugenics and Racial Uplift Among New Negroes, 1915 to 1935, and Pop EU, Popular Eugenics in Television and Film. Dr. Sherman and the Acumen Group researchers are currently working on a new volume of narratives documenting the untold stories of Black women who survived forced sterilization under eugenic mandates, called Womanish. And you can learn more about her organization or this organization at theacumengroup.org. And we will be placing that in the chat. So I'm going to ask, so Dr. Sherman is on. And family, for this presentation, please engage with us through the webinar chat. And if you have specific questions that you would like for us to ask Dr. Sherman, please place those questions in the Q&A box, and we will ask them later in the evening during our Q&A portion. So now I will turn it over to Dr. Sherman. Please welcome her.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. It is an absolute pleasure. It's an honor to be here. Just to give you a bit more background, as a public historian, my job is to ensure that all of the discourse, the information that's usually placed before students and other scholars trickles down to the folks who need to know it the most. So the lectures that I provide through the Acumen Group are for anyone and everyone who's prepared to get in and learn. I am a student of Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, so I believe that everyone has the capacity. It's just about unlocking certain things. So this is an open space. If you have questions and we get to them here, that's fine. If we happen to run out of time, which I often do, feel free to jot down your questions and email them to me later, because we believe in engaging to make sure that you walk away retooled, armed, and with a full understanding of what eugenics is and how it impacts everything around you, from the moment you get up in the morning to the moment you go to bed. All right. With that, I'm going to start this presentation, I believe. Over there. All right, can you see the slides there?
Not yet.
Okay. All right. Let's try this again. Screen here. Tell me what you got.
We got it.
All right, good.
Wonderful. Yep.
Technology,
Technology.
technology is not always my friend here, so good. All right. So tonight, again, please understand that eugenics is a science, and we'll get into all of that, but it impacts almost every part of our daily lives. It is infused in everything from our housing, our education, our politics, our law enforcement, our beauty products. And so it's like a sprinkler system that hits every person high and low. It hits you no matter what your socioeconomics is. But one of the things that's extremely troubling is the way it impacts our education system. And it has been since its inception. All right. So here are part of the issues with the learning curves that we're looking at right now. Students in the US cannot do math or read well, and this is particularly problematic for Black students. Looking at the numbers here, we're looking at areas almost across the country where the failure rate is in the 80s, is in the 80 percentile. Some as high as 89% in areas of Texas, and in Washington, D.C., 85% failing rates for standardized testing and just regular math, regular classes in both math and in reading, 85%, 87%. It is not as if Black children are unable to do the subjects, to matriculate properly. But there are instances that we're going to see where nothing is expected and therefore little or nothing is being taught. Within this same space, currently, we're looking at issues where studies are being done because there's a grave concern that when students are in class, um, they're kept from learning based upon the fact that they're being targeted, and the studies and the science are behind this. They're actually being targeted by instructors as having behavioral problems. So there are a lot of punitive actions. And what became extremely um, depressing and alarm bells ringing for me was the fact that you had kindergarten students, preschool students, who were being subject to not just suspension, which would be crazy enough, but expulsions at 3 and 4 years old. As a historian studying eugenics, this for me was a direct link back to children being considered problematic from the womb. So these children are being targeted from the moment they enter into a school system, with having behavioral problems, being disrespectful, being dangerous, and in violations of rules. And so even the US Department of Education is starting to take note of the fact that you have more Black children on any given day out of school through expulsions or suspensions or some other punitive action than you do in school. Unnatural outcomes, again, preschool enrollment, Black children make up just 19%, but were basically 47% of the suspensions. And these are multiple suspensions. So at a time when most children are still learning how to interact with each other, they've just been potty trained, they're 3 and 4 years old, you actually have teachers who are labeling them as a threat. The teachers feel threatened by 3 year olds and 4 year olds. And when children do what they normally do, which is tantrums, increasingly the police are being called in. So, of course, the child isn't necessarily going to respond well to anyone but the parent at this point. But even that resistance is considered to be aggressive. And what I found is through the literature of early eugenic tropes, this was not uncommon. For a lot of folks, eugenics was a dead science. People actually call it a pseudoscience sometimes today. But what I'm finding is that the language, the protocol that originally inculcated our systems, to help build our systems, our institutions, never changed its thoughts about eugenics in the first place. So if you don't understand how eugenics plays its role, you don't know how to properly go in to defend your child, to knock these institutional mandates down, and to advocate for better classrooms and fairer schools. So let's take a look for a moment. 1924, the research on Black children not being able to progress through school, the blame was placed on what were called race traits. And race traits were considered to be genetic. So this is where we get the 3Ds. All right. The 3Ds were listed as defective, dependent, or delinquent. So the first, a Black student is limited by an innate intelligence. He does not have the ability to learn. His capacity to learn is basically stymied, and that is considered to be a child who is defective. Black students underperform because they are likely in a poor or underprivileged neighborhood or in an environment that's poor and underprivileged. Therefore, academic achievement is not necessarily what's expected for them or from them because it's a condition of their social conditioning, their habitus. And for those who are sociology students, their habitus informs them that they don't necessarily need to go to school or they don't necessarily need to learn. And so, based upon those poor, underprivileged environments, they're not expected to do anything but be a burden or dependent upon the state. And then finally, Black children have inherently poor character and are unable to learn because of disciplinary problems and willful laziness. And so this is where the delinquent labeling comes in. That delinquent labeling, again, is the reason why the police are called or the truant officers are taking, if we still have truant officers in some instances, they're taking the children to holding spaces, which are basically detention centers or cells. And depending on how that child reacts to the authority before them, they are further classified as children who are aggressive, who may have quote unquote mental health problems. And basically, they're pulled from the school system altogether and put into homes for delinquents, they're put into reformatories, or they're put into prisons. Again, this is not new. So, what I'm about to do now is take you on a little historical ride through the early American eugenics movement so that you have a clear understanding of exactly how we got to this point. Eugenics was a term that was officially coined roughly 1830, 1840. Francis Galton came up with the language for it, but the science of eugenics, the pseudoscience, the burgeoning science, the theories of eugenics have been around for a couple of centuries, quite honestly. All right. But the idea of being well born is an agrarian theory that basically says, in the same way that you can cross pollinate plants or animals to breed in certain characteristics and to breed out certain characteristics, we should be able to do that as humans. It is some mad scientist, European, who decided that he could create better people and that in order to breed out the things that we don't want, we need to ensure that those who have great genes only marry others who have great genes, and those who have bad genes are kept from having children at all. Here are some of the theories that Galton purported early on in 1840. In the same way that genes, or what they called at the time germplasm, transmitted character traits such as honesty, morality, criminality, intelligence, violence, and poverty. In the same way that hair color and hair texture and things like that are transmitted from the parents, so too was it believed that if you had a relative who was immoral, that there was a gene, there was germplasm in your body that was a gene basically for immorality, and that any person in that family line had a trait for immorality or criminality, or in this instance, intelligence. What is most telling about these theories is that they also place poverty in the space of genetics, meaning if you're in a poor family or you come from an impoverished background, it is in your DNA to remain impoverished. These are considered to be innate traits that cannot be changed. These traits are specifically tied to development of public policy for schools, social work, and the juvenile justice system. So we'll see this come up often. If you're in a school system, for instance, in a neighborhood that's not doing particularly well socioeconomically, you'll find that the school does not necessarily get the same dollars and cents that other school districts that are faring better or are in different jurisdictions are in. And it would seem that you would want to put more money into a space where you realize more help is needed. That is just the opposite. If you're relying on eugenic laws and theories, what you're saying is that these people will not matriculate. Their children will not do any better than they have. And so it is a waste of money and resources to put money into these schools and into these children and into their lunch programs or into their learning programs, their if they need tutoring or anything like that, that's out. All right. You either sink or you swim, or we, no child left behind, just pass you along until you're out of our particular space. The unfit or weak have the capacity to contaminate the fit through both formal and informal contact. So they must be segregated. Years ago, if there was a student who was not doing as well as other students, the idea was to give them additional assistance through an aide that may also be in the class. The rest of the students would keep going with the teacher, but you had an aide that would specifically work with that or those students who may need extra help. Very slowly, what you start to see happening if folks are under eugenic protocols is to take that child out of that classroom altogether and to put all of the children who are quote unquote weak in a class by themselves, or to basically move them out of the general population of the students. Sometimes we would say they're in a separate wing. They're in the classroom that's above the cafeteria, but the job was to keep them out of sight, out of mind, and to keep them from possibly contaminating the students who were actually quote unquote fit. Also, the unfit should be kept from reproducing through either segregation or reproductive sterilization. Now, I won't go into the reproductive sterilizations because that's a whole course as opposed to me just giving you a bit of information. So I'm not even going to open that door. However, a lot of times when children, young people today are moved into juvenile justice systems, it is a short walk between there and the actual penal system. And currently within our penal system, as of December 2023, you still had states like California where they were forcibly sterilizing the women who were in the California State Penitentiary to ensure that they did not reproduce other criminals. All right. So you need to be extremely cautious and careful with the police coming into school systems because it's a sure way of eventually ending up in this same space. And it's a very eugenic space. Eugenicists also believe that the unfit produced more often and recklessly, and that this would eventually lead to the overpopulation of a poor, criminal, ignorant underclass. By the sheer numbers, what we're starting to see globally is that Black people are in a majority minority situation across the globe. There are more non-white people than there are white people. And so that is one of the reasons why you're starting to see these shifts in policy for almost everything. We're banning books all over again. We're conscripting certain people in certain places off limits or on limits based upon who's in need of the services and access to certain things right now. So you're starting to see this a lot. Overpopulation of Black people or overpopulation of Black children in a school system that's now a majority of white young females as the instructors, the administrators. And even if you're in a space like Washington, D.C., and you have Black administrators, they are still using this eugenic rubric, which means you can't say it's racism per se, because the leader of the bunch is Black. And so you're kind of at your wits' end in how to describe it or define it or fight against it, because you can't just say it's racism. You have to look at this as a scientific eugenic approach. And when you do, you start to see this is about the fit over the unfit. This is about keeping those who are considered to be deficient, um, delinquent, or dependent in a space where they cannot contaminate or influence those who are considered to be fit. So with Francis Galton, um, he also noted that mental and moral characteristics of race defined the race. So you'll start to also understand that, and I'll get to this later, that when you have students who are Black who are exceptional, oftentimes they are considered to be problematic. So they never get into the talented and gifted programs. They never get into the accelerated programs, because no matter what it is that they do, they're kind of being targeted, and it's figured that they can't really be that smart. They're cheating. um, there's some type of way that they're not necessarily as smart as we believe they are. And so as a result, that hereditary unchangeable belief that Black people are inherently not educatable, few are educated. Those who are educated are mimicking or imitating white people, quote unquote, but that this could never be just a God-given ability to learn and to think. This is Galton's stretch. And you're going to start to see how this impacts also our laws and our institutions across the board. So, classification systems. Eugenics holds that of any person of African ancestry constitutes an unevolved lower class of man or subspecies. Cultural anthropologists and early scientists classified Africans as subhumans who sat at the top of the monkey chain and the bottom of the human chain. Our US laws, including the Dred Scott decision, and Plessy versus Ferguson, use the theoretical construct of Blacks as subspecies in the decision. I would implore you to if you go to Google and then do Google Scholar, it'll give you a lot of original documents. As a historian, I tend to read other people's books, but more often, my goal is to go to the original documents to interpret for myself. Because even as you see the number of books that are behind me, what I'm starting to find out is that there are a lot of people who are not Black who are writing about Black people. And so when you go into an archives and you look at documents, the original documents, handwritten, your interpretation of what you see based upon the fact that you are Black, culturally, you have an understanding sometimes that other folks don't. And so sometimes things are hidden in plain view. Is Zora Neale Hurston, hitting a straight lick with a crooked stick type of deal where we're talking in code and the person who's looking at the original documents may have missed something. So when we start talking about our laws, Dred Scott cases, Plessy versus Ferguson, when you go to Google Scholar, you're going to find the original case law, and you're going to find the summaries, and you're going to look at the actual language of our Supreme Court justices saying Black people represent a subspecies, and no white person on this planet is subject to do anything to assist them or share in the bounty of what it is that we have, because we are human and these folks are not necessarily human. Those decisions, by the way, influence education policies, including curricula, funding, and expectations of Black students. So the goal again was to create an American phenotype. And so what our country decided to do at one point was to start having baby contests. So they came up with the concept of better babies and fitter families. So every year when the state fair would come to your particular state, in the same way that you would judge the prize heifer and the biggest squash and whatever else, you would have families that would come together to be judged, and they would be measured, and notes would be taken. And at the end of this process, someone would be given an award as having the best American family phenotype. This is what the look of fitness looks like. This sounds silly and it sounds almost arbitrary, but understand that um, how you appear to people in school systems, how you appear as the parents of the students, and how the students come into the classroom also dictates how they are placed in certain classes. All right. Like I said, it's mind blowing, but we start to get into measurements. So at one point in this country under eugenics, our school systems and our public health administrators would bring people in, just kind of going through the county or within your school. Many of you may have experienced a situation where you're at school and the nurse decided they were doing measurements. And they would come in and they would do measurements of your arm and your height and your weight and put you through certain tests or whatever. This wasn't just for fun. These were the old eugenic tests that were always used. What you're looking at on the screen right now was a eugenics test that was done. It was administered at Tuskegee University in 1932 when it was Tuskegee Institute. You'll see at the top where it says pure Negro. This means this was a dark skinned Black person. And what you see below are some of the measurements. I believe in total there were 72 different classifications or categorizations that were used to basically note the bridge of the nose, the thickness of the lips. If your gums were a particular color, it signaled to the person who was giving you the examination that you had some type of defect. And the physical defect was a hint to the mental and the moral and the intellectual defect. So these tests and exams went on as early as 1907, 1908, and to some extent, we still use them. We use them and use the data sets for things like our manufacturing. So when you go to a store and you look at small, medium, and large, and then you try and figure out why is it that the clothes never actually fit Black people the way Black people want them to, is because we weren't a part of this original rubric of what is considered to be normal and the American phenotype. All right. Creating a national consensus of what fitness is. Being eugenically sound mentally, physically, morally, and intellectually was about also your citizenship, your marriageability, your social mobility. And so what you're seeing here, it wasn't just Black people and children who were being measured, but also college students across the board were being measured. And if you were in Ivy League schools, you had what they called the freshman nude photos. So if you were attending Yale, Harvard, Vassar, Brown, a number of institutions. Basically, as a freshman, you would go in, you would walk through, and they would measure every portion of your body in the same way you just saw with the Tuskegee listings. The goal was to see if you could figure out what the criteria was. What did beauty look like? What did intellect look like? What did these are what our new presidents will look like. This is what our administrators look like. And you do the same thing for the women. The goal then was to try and marry those men and women who fit into these molds together so that you could, quote unquote, breed the American phenotype that you wanted. You wanted a national consensus of what fitness was. And out of this grew the Miss America pageant. Out of this grew, again, your baby contest. It grew into all types of things where visually our job as just regular individual people would be to be able to look at a person walking down the street, or in the case of the students, children walking into a classroom, looking at their attire, looking at their facial features, and making a pronouncement based upon what we saw of what their intellect was, what their morality was, what their backgrounds were, and what the projection of their mobility would be in the future. How are you going to teach certain students if you're saying that all of them are equal, when at the same time your mind has been taught that these need to be pushed over to this side? This girl looks like she's going to be a problem later on, even though she's only 9. This boy looks like trouble. These are the things sometimes that schools have taught their teachers and their administrators to look at in order to define this child before they ever sit down and start taking actual tests. So, bodies as human capital. Again, you just saw the men and women, the Ivy Leaguers, and their posture. Many of you may have come up at a time when you had etiquette classes where you were walking around. They may want you to walk around with the book on your head and all of that. Or you had parents, if they were going to travel or if they were going to a doctor's office, they would put on their Sunday best. And the rationale behind that was, if you're outside and you're in the public and you look a particular way, your neighbors at one point could actually label you as dysgenic or unfit. They could label the children, even though they were smart and healthy and whole, they could label them as being problematic. They could label them as being maligned or not taken care of properly, or in a process where if someone didn't intercede, the children would begin to what they call degenerate. The children would start to turn into problems because of the environment they were in, the other people that were around them, or one or two bad children, quote unquote, who had infiltrated a particular space. So even again, before you get to a point where you're taking IQ tests, visually looking at each other, we've learned in this country to assume certain things about a child's intellect, a grown person's mental capacity, their educatability, based upon what we see and how we're defining them as intelligent, fit, unfit, or problematic. And so when we get to the actual testing phase, these are some of the actual tests that you see here. Because you didn't have everyone going to school and learning at the same time, or learning the same things at the same time, or we call different things by different names, you once again would have Black students not necessarily faring particularly well. The tests were designed, one of the gentlemen, Alfred Terman, the goal was to make a visual exam. So you have something missing to the right. You have something on each one of the faces that you see there that's supposed to be drawn in. You also have the children. This was a test that was given to 6-year-olds. And the idea was that a quote unquote normal 6-year-old would be able to tell which faces were ugly. And by ugly, they were also bad, which faces were the criminal faces. And so, fast forward, if you even will, to the Mamie and Kenneth Clark doll test. Which doll is bad? Which doll is ugly? Which doll is the criminal? Which one is dirty? These are things that we're teaching children. They're not only assessing others around them, but they're assessing themselves. So by the time you have a child, a young Black child saying they're likening themselves to the white doll because they don't want to call themselves bad based upon the fact that they have brown skin. This is what you're looking at when you start looking at the way these tests are grouped together. Some of them are written tests, but because you had loads of folks who hadn't been to school at all, you have an influx of immigrants at the same time. A lot of the tests were actually given where it wasn't worded. There were photos. But you're all going to get one consensus. How do you determine what beauty is? How do you determine who's good or who's bad? How do you know to steer away from this particular type of person? And so this is what you start to get with your early testing. So this is just a quick bit of a timeline. You start to see shifting views on education and testing between 1840 and 1875. And the issue here, even because the reason why you have a shift is because for the first time ever, it is no longer against the law for Black people to learn. It is no longer an offense that is punishable by death or imprisonment or lashes or fines. Black people are overwhelmingly going into basements and into churches and creating historically Black colleges and universities and normal schools and common schools in order to learn how to read. And suddenly it becomes important to create a public school system where we need to get control over who will be considered the American ideal, who is the American phenotype. We don't necessarily want the very people who a few years later in 1896, you're going to call subhuman again with Plessy versus Ferguson here in 1875, going to school not necessarily with your child, but learning the same things that your children are learning. And then we get to 1875 to the end of World War I. It's the exact same logic. The development and administration of a range of new testing instruments to measure mental ability. What's happened at the end of World War I? You've had Black men who've gone off overseas and gone to war, and they start to understand that outside in the rest of the world, they are not conscripted in the same way. And many of them stayed in these foreign ports and made their lives there because they wanted their children to be able to do better. The ones who came back talking about double V, the double victory. Why would I fight abroad and not fight at home? So they came back with a different sense of, we want to not just go to college, but we want to build additional colleges, and we want our children to have formal public education. Why? Because we're paying our taxes. We've been to war, and as American citizens, we deserve to have the access, the mobility that everyone else who are American citizens have. When we get to 1900, 1932, the tests and testing programs start to proliferate. And once again, we've gone through the Great Depression. We're starting to see Black people even enter into white universities and matriculate and go to the top of their classes. You're starting to see this fear that the weak are now infiltrating these spaces. And so it wasn't uncommon for the students to at times be told, you can be in here, there are only 2 Black people here. We're not desegregating the school, but we need to place you outside the door. Or you need to in the back of the classroom and have it taped off so that the rest of the students actually have no ability to pass by you or to be contaminated by you. These are some of the humiliations that these college age students had to face. But at the same time, the understanding is we now need to test and create different tests to ensure that we only have the best of America in these spaces. 1924, measures of achievement become intertwined with decision making. Once again, understanding how the eugenics movement um, informs educational policy. In 1924, we had the Buck versus Bell decision. We also had what was called the Race Integrity Act. And the Race Integrity Act said that we're no longer talking about Caucasoid and Mongoloid and these 5 races of men. In America in 1924, it was determined, and this was the state of Virginia, who was just cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs when it came to eugenic laws. The Race Purity Act said that there are only 2 races, white and non-white. This becomes important then as is important today, because when you look at language that says Black people are more likely to do this or Black people are doing X, Y, and Z, please understand that in some instances, these statistics are not counting us, Black people. They're counting non-white people. They're putting anyone who didn't classify themselves as white into the category with Black. Right? And so it is important to understand how statistics are made and the function of statistics. And so I'll get into the lead statistician, um, Frederick Hoffman, who was at Prudential Life Insurance. And if you have Prudential Life Insurance, I'm still mad with them, so I don't touch Prudential Life Insurance. But this man made a whole stink about Black people and how Black people were animals, did not deserve insurance, could not be insured, did not deserve to be in any place but cages. And his 330-page treatise is what school systems decided that they would use in order to create their applied eugenics mandates, manuals, and textbooks. So when we get into the classifications as well, this again is important. You take the test, whether it's the written test, the IQ test, and what happens with the measurements? What happens with the results? Well, when you get the results back, it basically will group those who didn't fare particularly well into one of these 6 categories. And there's a 6th category, that's 5, but there's a 6th category, feeble-minded, which is a little bit above this. If a person has the capacity of a 3 to 4-year-old, they're considered to be an idiot. Low-grade imbecile, 5 to 7-year-olds, medium-grade imbecile, 8 to 9 years old, high-grade imbecile, about the capacity of a 9-year-old, and then a moron is considered to be someone with the mental capacity of maybe a 10 to 11-year-old. The concept also of feeble-mindedness means that that person is hidden in plain view. That person doesn't necessarily look as though they are quote unquote contaminated or have bad genes. So you have, again, teachers who are literally using this mainframe, and you'll notice off to the right of this, the idiot is only supposed to take classes or be pushed into coursework where it's about self-preservation, how to tie your shoes, how to lock doors, how to wash your face, that type of thing. Low-grade imbecile, simple menial work. So you're going to be on a track in school to only do very basic things like perhaps housework. Simple manual work is the medium grade imbecile. You're allowed in the school system to do things that are repetitive but don't require mental work. High grade imbecile, complex manual work. So this may be someone who's a gardener or maybe handling equipment. And then the moron, working, requiring some reason and judgment. This may be a chauffeur or X, Y, and Z. But just understanding eugenically how this chart determined how most Americans in this country are placed as children within the public school system and how they then matriculate. It's imperative to understand that once you are put into these categories, there was no way of working your way out of it. And so when you start to have students say, "I'm bored in class. I don't understand. I don't understand why I'm getting this ridiculous work." and they end up dropping out, that's still part of the main frame of classification. You weren't really supposed to stay here because you don't even have the aptitude to do these basic things. Recently, I went to a space where they were talking about social emotional learning or emotional social learning, currently 2022, 2023. And one of the teachers said, our goal is to teach the kids basic hygiene. Now, these were kids that were in ninth grade. So we're teaching them how to wash themselves and wash their clothes. And I said, but you're a ninth grade English teacher. Why are you teaching them how to cross their legs and um, this rudimentary type of thing? And I wanted her to be able to answer me, but she just said, this is part of the protocol that we've been given, the mandates for what it is that they're expected to learn because their development isn't quite what it could be. Now, in 2022, that sounded a lot like this old rubric that I originally found in 1907. Going back again to the concepts of defective, delinquent, and dependent, the concept of pauper classes. If a person is poor, they cannot learn. If a child is experiencing any type of childhood trauma or anything else, the child is blamed and they're considered delinquent. They're acting out. Not we need to have a counselor or someone talk to the child or talk to the parents and kind of bring them in and determine what's going on. The child is the problem. Defective, if the child needs extra help, is considered to be innate and problematic for the rest of the class and for the rest of the school system. So, what is the meaning to the measurements? Again, I'm over here with Frederick Hoffman, the statistician for Prudential Life Insurance. Again, this was a statistician. His job, his entire job was to collect data sets. The question was, from whom did he collect the data sets? It's like when someone today would say, we did a survey and 14% of Black people said X, Y, and Z. And the first thing you say is, no one called me. All right. To show you how dangerous this is in real time. A few years ago, when COVID first hit, there was a report that came out that said 100% of the people who died of COVID in Richmond, Virginia were African American. And I said, okay, let's look at the actual report. Now, the report went out over the news. Everyone was talking about it. Oh my goodness, Black people are dying. Ugh. Okay, let's look at the actual report. It turns out that the report showed 10 people. And I said 10, just 10 people. And those 10 people were in one retirement home. Every last person who passed away, yes, they were Black. They were in a retirement home. All of them had conditions that were already impairing their lungs. They already had pneumonia. They already had interstitial lung disease. They had other issues going on with their lungs. And then we all know that when you go into these rehabilitation centers, sometimes it's just a place to pick up extra germs, unfortunately. All right. It was 10 people. And every last one of them even was over the age of 80. The average age was 86 years old. All right. But the statistics said 100% of the people who died from COVID in Richmond at that point were African American. And so all of a sudden you had people, well, what do we need to do to help Black people to take the shot? Or what do we need to do to make Black people do X, Y, and Z? Hoffman was dangerous back in 1896 when he wrote The Race, Trace, and Tendencies of the Negro. He didn't know Negroes. He didn't know Black people. But from his desk and from wherever he was, he basically came up again with a 330-page treatise. That's not an article. That's a series of books, basically. And he says that education was of no benefit to the efficiency of the Negro as a laborer because Black people were only to be laborers. They weren't supposed to use their minds for anything other than doing what white people said. Okay. In fact, education of the young, he says, together with an increase in so-called education, there has not been as much progress in their morality as would take place if the education were genuine and not as it is, in fact, a mere varnish of questionable values. So, based upon what Hoffman writes here, you then had jurisdictions, governors who were saying, Oh no, Hoffman, he's a statistician. He deals with numbers and science is important. He's saying the morality of Black people hasn't increased. It hasn't gotten better, which means if they were truly learning anything, it would make them act the way we want them to act. It would cut down on certain things that we don't believe they should be able to, they should be doing at this point as civilized people. And so we don't need to put money into their education. So you can imagine then what happens when you have sharecroppers or people who are working on farms. And it's like, no, we're not going to put money into a school, number one, so there is one. If there is a school, we're not going to put very much into it. So when the white kids are finished with their books, we'll throw them over there. When the white kids are finished with their school, if we don't decide to tear it down, we'll just let you mosey on over there. We may give you one teacher to teach all 12 grades. And so again, the concept was, why put money into a space where you know it will not um, render the results that you want? It'll only agitate Black people because then they'll want to leave off of these sharecropping farms, and it'll give them ideas, quote unquote, above their station. So when we look at the concept of defectives in 1910, the goal then, standardization of teachers' judgments and medical officers. Once again, teachers and medical officers, public health, and the school system. Classifications needed to be homogenous and go across these two spaces. All right. This way, you can associate mental capacity, physique, and environment. That's all still eugenic. Unclean and damaged clothing, as well as poor hearing and teeth, mark low intellectual capacity in children, in kids. Where did people come up with this? But once you put it into a book and you're a eugenicist and you saying this is the new science of things, I don't have running water, so my clothes are as clean as they can be. There are a couple of buttons torn off something. There's a rip in something. We don't have needle and thread, but I'm here. That child's capacity to learn then is attached to visually what they look like, how their clothes look, if they have a tooth that's fallen out. All right. Kids must be studied from the standpoint of science without prejudgment and bridled emotions to understand the relative importance of the conditions which produce the pauper, the imbecile, and the criminal. Once again, this was written in 1910, and it was part of a school district in Georgia. I don't know that it was Atlanta for the people that are there, but for Georgia, where basically you have the founding fathers, the keepers of the property and the budget, saying this is what we're going to use to determine if and how we're going to spend money in particular places, understanding that we want to return on what it is that we're putting out. Delinquent, all right. 1914, you'll see a little bit of the criminal justice system here with this as well. Mary Bartlemy worked with this gentleman named Judge Arnold. She's in Chicago, all right. Her job, because the judge really didn't want to have to deal with the number of Black people who were migrating into Chicago by the thousands on a daily basis. Okay. And it wasn't as if the children were delinquent in any way, shape, fashion, or form. They were just moving into a new area, learning, the do's and don'ts, getting used to all types of things that they didn't necessarily have to deal with in their southern or rural spaces. So if the child, a young girl specifically, was brought into the courthouse, this particular woman would get them. And this is her assessment. In recent years, we have had a large number of colored girls who have come up from the South to Chicago because their fathers have sent for them. So I love the fact that their fathers are pulling them from the South to the North to be educated and to matriculate better. Their education has not been equal to the education of white girls, and their mental development has not been the same. Based upon their mental development, she would then go through and recommend that the girls would be sent to a reformatory. In those reformatories, only because you're saying their mental development was uneven. We're going to take a quick look at that as well. You're trying to say that if their mental development in these books is unequal to the white girls, then they must also have a criminality or an immorality or some other type of gene that just hasn't lit up yet. And that's going to create a problem for you in the space that you're in now in Chicago. 2024, Black children are more likely to be diagnosed with disruptive disorders such as oppositional defiant disorder. If any of you come across ODD, red flag, and I'm not saying just red flag, the flag is red and it's on fire. ODD is characterized as frequent or continual anger, irritability, arguing, and defiance towards parents and other authority figures. It includes being spiteful, vengeful, and vindictive. The cause is unhealthy home and unhealthy parents. Based upon what I've told you, this is as eugenic as you get. And the fact that you have children as young as 3 and 4 years old being diagnosed ODD, how is a 3-year-old vengeful? How are they spiteful? Okay. Um, Dependent children living below the poverty level. Persons who are unable or unwilling to support themselves without aid from others, pauperism leads on towards crime, prepares the nest out of which loathsome diseases of the body and soul are hatched, and that evil is contagious. No marble walls can separate our children from the contaminating influence of pauperism. So you don't even want to have poor children. Again, sometimes in the school system, if a child is from a neighborhood, even if it's 2 blocks from the neighborhood that everyone else is in, that child, if that child has a single parent, if that child comes to school different from the other kids, that child has a mark on them that says that they could potentially influence the other kids and contaminate them and create, look at this evil. It's an evil contagion. All right. That was 1920. 2020. Black children and children from poor families are rarely identified for gifted education services. These services include enrichment, special classes, and focused projects intended to help students excel in areas in which they show signs of exceptional potential and talent. That is because in 2020, like in 1920, what you're saying to me is that their pauperism supersedes any giftedness that they may have. And again, this is problematic in ways that we're still living with. The concept of human waste in 1954. Many of you may be old enough to have seen the film The Blackboard Jungle. Um, Sometimes Hollywood will take a page from the streets, the current events, and other times it's the current events that they're pulling back and forth. It's a symbiotic relationship in many instances. Um, there's a scene in the Blackboard Jungle, which starred the amazing Sidney Poitier, who looks like a very young man at that point. But the concept of human waste is a eugenic concept. I don't like it. I don't even like the term, but I need you to understand um, how our children are being discussed and talked about sometimes. One of the scenes, there's a man who says to the other teachers, they have us with college degrees to come here and sit on the garbage can and keep the students in school so women in the city can walk around for a few hours without being attacked. The slight of this film deals with boys. They're all boys in this particular school, but they're considered to be animals. They're talked about as though they're feral. They're talked about as though they are a danger to society. And the fact that the teacher said they're human waste, they're garbage. Our job is to sit on the top of the trash can lid to keep them out of the streets, to keep the public order. But we don't expect anything from them at any case. In Washington, D.C., where I am, we also came across a number of reports that came out as soon as the Brown versus Board of Education decision came down in 54. One of them was an investigation called an investigation of public school conditions that was handed over to the subcommittee to investigate public school standards and conditions and juvenile delinquency in DC. The person who wrote this was out of Louisiana. And everything that he says, it just became like a litany from an old eugenic tablet. Among the problems cited in the report were fighting, lying, stealing, vandalism, obscene writing, vulgar talk, absenteeism, tardiness, and truancy, as well as more serious offenses. Of particular concern were offenses revolving around sex. Sex problems in the predominantly integrated schools have become a matter of vital concern to the parents. Now, keep in mind, DC schools weren't even having issues with integration at this point. But in the imagination of this particular man, not only were the kids slow and stupid, but this other thing, the fighting, the lying, this is a issue of character and morality. And then the idea that they're going to commit some type of sexual offense. So just with the human waste comments up here and the sitting on the trash can with the blackboard jungle, we're afraid that the women in the city will be attacked if these delinquent boys, these uneducatable boys, are left out into the street. So we're bringing them in here, and we just have to keep them here. The number of times I've heard school teachers today talk about the fact that it's almost impossible to teach. My job is just to kind of sit here and babysit teenagers. And I'm going, but what is the answer to this? How do we fight against this? What are we to do with this? And the answer is we don't know. That's because the policies and the belief is that these are children who cannot and will not and innately don't have the ability to do certain things because they are quote unquote dysgenic. Also, the problem with those who are migrating from the South to the North years ago was the concept of overaged Black children. And the basically what would happen, the young lady, for instance, in the original report, um, her father has sent for her. She's now in Chicago. Well, if you're working in a sharecropping space, and Black folks were still sharecropping in the South, they're still doing it now, by the way. But I came up from a household where my parents were sharecropping in 1967, and I was born in 1970. All right. Sharecropping, there's no there's no slur on it aside from the fact that you weren't paid well, but these were farmers. And so the number of times that parents are told your children don't need to go to school because we have a crop that needs to get out. You're living on someone else's property. You're you're sharing in the crop development and the results that come from that. But if you decide you're not working, not only could you get fired, but that means that you're being evicted at the same time. And then because you're working where you're only getting paid once a year at the end of the year, once all the profits are made and everything is divided, and you get your little bit of this at the end of the year. There are many times when you walked away with nothing. So, as my mother has told me on a number of occasions, I think my grandfather and his wife, my grandparents, would work an entire year. They had 13 children. My mother's the last of those 13. My mother and her next oldest brother were the only ones who were allowed to go to school. All right. And I believe she entered when she was 7 years old. But if you could imagine her moving up to DC, which she did later on. But if you could imagine her coming into DC and she's at that point 9, 10, or 11 years old, but you have to start school where you're supposed to start. So could you imagine her as an 11-year-old sitting in the first grade? So instantly, you have what are called overage Negro children. And those overage children are considered to be backward. They're considered to be dullards because for their age, they really shouldn't just be learning how to read, but you're not looking at the circumstances. So the number of Black people, I love Isabella Wilkerson and The Warmth of Other Suns, and I love all of that. I think that the sequel to that, which someone else may need to write at some point, needs to talk about the fact that you had so many children who came into these northern enclaves and found that this was a predatory, offensive, aggressive space to have to learn. The schools were not particularly nice. And they often, it was better than the schools that you had in the South, true. But often these students were segregated. They were targeted for not just the abuse of the students that were around them, but the teachers who believed that these were the worst of us. Also, understand that Black people have their own version of eugenics. And that is some of what I write about a lot of times, where you have Black people who have made it to a particular point, but they're still using the same eugenic construct. They're still using that same rubric that white people have used. Now they've morphed it, they've changed it a bit, but it goes to things like those Black people in the North or in cities are better than or more fit than those who are in the South, or who are in some instance lighter or darker, or who are thinner or wider. And you start to get into these other isms that we actually took on. So if you're looking at your kid and you're in a predominantly Black school, but you're still having your child not matriculate in the same way that they're supposed to, and you're thinking, once again, I can't say it's racism because the teachers are Black. No, it may not be racism, but it's definitely eugenic. And so you have to be able to understand what that is and what that means so that you can go to that teacher. I don't care what their race is. I don't care what their orientation is. I don't care where they're from. Their job is to teach every student and to see the value in every student. And I think that, part of the issue is we want you to learn this from here to here and this from here to here. But life is an ongoing learning process. And so there are a number of folks who weren't able to go to high school, period. And as adults, were able to not only get that high school diploma, but to also go on and get advanced degrees because they were able to sit down and take time and do it. That is not about capacity. Right? That's not about capacity. And so we have to go through a process where we try and change the rubric. And in order to do that, we have to understand these scientific eugenic constructs that are still in place, that are forcing so many more children, another generation of children, um, out into a space where they will not be able to matriculate and where they're going to have a difficult time, especially as into AI and all these other, spaces where you need to be able to think. You need to be able to think on your feet and matriculate. So, as I wrap this up, and I actually did well, it didn't go over. What can we do? All right. Dependency, deficiencies, and delinquencies are so interdependent, and their causes are mingled. All right. Um, but do not forget that the school system will ultimately blame the child's heredity or environment for educational failures. And we gotta change that. We have to change that. So here are a few things that we must do or must attempt to do. Even if you don't have children, attend PTA and community meetings to know what the school's plans are. Develop language and treaties to address school boards and demand new methods for charting student progress other than standardized tests. And this is an important current event, I guess, and it's going to be current for a while. As the Supreme Court looks at striking down affirmative action and legacy appointments into different universities, some universities decided no more standardized tests, period. We're not taking ACTs and SAT results in order for you to get into our school. You're going to have to do it on your own merits and other means of getting into the school. Immediately, a number of Ivy League schools decided, nah, we're getting too much pushback. So they opted out. So depending on where your child wants to go to school, do you do the SATs and the ACTs? Is it still of value? That's something that you have to watch. But understanding that if you're going to do SAT and ACT and try and deride them and figure out the biases within them, you also need to go back to the original standardized tests, which begin in third grade. They're doing the third grade and the eighth grade. Again, the rationale for third grade and eighth grade is because all Black people are supposed to peak. They're supposed to peak in their intellectual development and their mental capacity by the age of 9. It is the reason why some white people will still call Black men boys, all right? Call Black women girls, call them by their first names, because the understanding is you've never left childhood. And your behavior is not just talking to you as though, I'm racist and I'm talking to you crazy, but I'm talking to you like the child I believe that you are, based upon what I believe is your mental and emotional capacity. And so you have to be able to understand that and break it apart. Um, Create grassroots organizations that protect children from eugenic labeling. And that's from everyone, all right? Not just the school system, but every person. Any organization, any place where you go, where you're starting to hear kids spoken of as idiot or they're slow. I heard someone at a PTA meeting one time called a child feral, and the two teachers were speaking to each other. Both of them were Black people, and I'm overhearing this when they took a break, and it was a Black female. She said to the brother that was there, excuse my language, what's in the bitches comes out in the pups. Now, I don't even have kids, but I was lit and I was ready to fight both of them. Like, okay, unacceptable. Like, I need names. I need to know like what your problem is. It's like, how dare you? The fact of the matter is, these are people who are setting policies for your kids, and you need to know who they are, and you need to be able to stop them in their tracks. Now, I got all the apologies in the world from this woman, but it was like, nah, I'm still taking you to task, and I'm still dealing with her to this day. Make others, especially your elected officials, aware of the eugenic origins of our current student assessments. No one teaches eugenics anymore, with the exception of maybe me and a few others. So, based on that, I'm sure there are a few of you who have never heard this information before. And so I can understand why you have leaders that don't get it. I doubt seriously that Maxine Waters knows that her California penal system is sterilizing Black women right now. I like to believe that she doesn't. But elected officials don't necessarily know either. And so we need to pull everyone to the carpet and hold everyone accountable. And then finally, form informal learning labs for students who need cultural competency and patience to master subjects. And when I say students, I mean students of all ages. Those of you who are adults that realize that your own reading and math skills are not what they could be, the easiest way to help and protect your child is for you to help and protect yourself. And so you need to know when the teacher is giving him the wrong answer on purpose, or is maligning or doing X, Y, and Z. But you also need to know the answers to the questions. So there's no shame in going back. And again, if we can teach each other, again, in small informal groups, with the love and capacity that we have for each other as Black folks, and we want you to survive, and we want you to do wonderful things, and we want your children to be able to learn from you in a safe space, and not necessarily everyone else out in the street. So we want to bring the classroom back into the home, where the child feels safe and feels comfortable. Also, if you know people, kids who are in informal and non-traditional spaces, they're with grandparents or aunts or uncles because their parents are away for whatever reason. Be that bridge that helps that child to learn, because grandma and grandpa and older aunties and uncles don't necessarily know what the digital blackboard is, or how to hook up the Wi-Fi, or how to help the child learn with the newfangled technology. If you have the skill to do that, have the heart and the compassion to set aside time to literally go into a community space, or people will allow you into their homes, you feel safe doing that, whatever the case may be, where you're teaching them, the adults, and the child at the same time, how to matriculate and maneuver in these new spaces so that they don't find themselves caught up and behind the gun and having to deal with these 3D classifications that don't apply. All right. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you. I thank you. And I'm actually a little bit early in stopping. So I am prepared now to take your questions. I'm going to stop
Actually, don't stop sharing your
sharing.
screen just yet, because you have your
Okay.
contact information up there, and we want to give
Okay.
people just a bit of time to catch your information. So thank you, Dr. Sherman.
Yeah.
There are many thanks and coming through in the chat about your presentation. Wonderful presentation. And Dr. Sherman is putting back on the screen her contact information, where you can contact her, email her, and find more information about her organization, the Acumen Group. Okay, so we're going to give people a little bit of time to start typing your questions in the Q&A box. And while questions are coming in from the audience, I do have some questions, and I'm really excited for this conversation because I'm an educator myself. And
Great.
I would like to start off. Could you speak a little about the inferiority complex that um, some of our people may be dealing with growing up in this society, in this American society? And because I hear you talking about eugenics, I wonder how that ties into the inferiority complex some people may have.
Sure. That is a great question. There are all types of different connections to eugenics that deal specifically with how we feel about ourselves. And so a lot of times what I tell people is when people say your self-esteem, I always say your self-esteem is not what you think of yourself. Your self-esteem is what you've been told about yourself and what you've, unfortunately taken in. A lot of folks I understand grow up in spaces where they're not really supported the way that they should be. And when I deal with colorism and other things, I talk about the fact sometimes that we don't do it to be nasty, I don't think. But there are times when in your household, in your neighborhoods, in your communities, you're given nicknames. And those nicknames sometimes are hurtful. But the children laugh it off and they just kind of go on about their business. But we internalize those things. And so when you start to realize that the adults around you aren't necessarily they may have come up with the name in a loving way, but it takes on a different life. They may have come up with the name to be not so kind. Um, but when you realize that sometimes adults and other people around you are not protecting you, they're not protecting your feelings or your emotions, you start to feel like I deserve this. This is who I am. And so, the only way to break out of that sometimes is to break away from what you've been told. And that takes work. That's therapy. In many instances, we deal, I've been an educator before on college campuses. And the number of times I've had to tell students, address me, like look me in the face, look me in the eyes. I'm no threat. And I realized they're used to putting their heads down. They're used to talking almost to a whisper if they feel like the person has an authority over them. And it's like, I don't like this. I need you to stand up, hope, put your shoulders back, talk to me. When you talk, stand up, say, I am, give me your name, say it with pride. And it's like, they don't feel the pride in it because they've not been shown the pride of it. And so that again is something that all of us we can fix it. It's something that's absolutely fixable. It's you coming across children, and the first thing I say to kids when I see them is, "Hey, smart guy, I love your hair. I love your eyes. You just look like a happy child. How was school today? Show me what you learned today. I know you learned something good." To really help them understand who they are. I mean, their kids are coming in as a blank slate. And so they only know about themselves what you tell them about themselves until they learn better or they're outside of different spaces. And then they either pick up who they are, quote unquote, from the outside, the friends, sometimes the not so good friends, or the college campuses, and they join sororities and fraternities sometimes to get an identity, to figure out who they are because they are still a blank slate, even though they've matriculated into high school and college.
Okay, wonderful. And so carrying on with that idea, um, I'm noticing from the idea of the eugenics theory that you presented that there was talk around mindset with a lot of teachers, educators, people who work with our students. What supports, what systems or structures do you think would need to be instituted into these schools to assist, to make it a better learning environment for Black children? And
In short, I'm sorry.
no, please go right ahead. Yes.
In short, show up. show up. It's one of the things that I've found across the globe at this point is that when a child shows up to school, whether it's a PTA meeting or some type of parent day or whatever, first day of school, or the child's in trouble, if the child shows up with one parent, especially if it's just the mother, that child is treated differently, right? You may not necessarily see it. You don't necessarily recognize that it's happening. But the belief is that if this child is showing up with one parent, then I can automatically put them over here in this category of either dependent, or this child is going to become a delinquent, or this child is going to be problematic because they don't have the quote unquote two family system, da 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 da. So I tend to tell parents, listen, I don't care if you're not together anymore. I don't care what your issues are. For the sake of this child, anything that's related to the school, I need you to show up as one body. All right. I need you to do that. The safety and the sanctity of your child's educational. Your child is in school more than they're at home during the week. So, you need to make sure that this is a safe space, and that bias is there, whether the teachers sometimes even realize it is. When dad shows up at the school with mom, all of a sudden attitudes change. All of a sudden, yeah, he did X, Y, and Z, or she did X, Y, and Z, but we're prepared to make it a slap on the wrist and da 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 da. So you start to see even how policies are down to what the person sees in front of them and how they interpret that family unit, and based upon that, how they interpret the environment and therefore the child.
Wonderful. Thank you. Um, so as we're having questions come in, can you talk a little bit about how you got started in this topic? What inspired you to do such research?
Initially, I dealt a lot with the images of Black people um, in television, film, because I understood that the average white person had very little interaction other with Black people, and so they usually ran on stereotype. And then, you know, once I made it into an academic space where I was one of only a handful of Black people on the entire campus. um, Lincoln, Nebraska is wonderful. Go Big Red. University of Nebraska, Lincoln is where I did my doctorate studies. And it was the first time I ever had a person come up to me and say that I was a pure Black. And I was like, what? What type of language are you speaking? But the person was using old school eugenic language, and it was said as a matter of fact, not as like a slight or something. But it was a student of mine, and he basically said, we have a lot of Black people here who are mixed race. One or both, one of their parents is Black, or they're adopted, and both the parents are white, and they just happen to be here. But they're all, for the most part, mixed race. So it's rare that you see a pure Black. And I was like, but where did that concept come from? So in looking it up, I realized it was an agricultural term that was assigned to the eugenics movement. And so I immediately went into Nebraska's archives and started digging it out. And I realized, oh, this is an entire system. This is something that connects once again to Dr. Frances Cress Welsing and the white supremacy and keys to the colors. And it was like, okay, it's all starting to make sense. This is a platform for things. And what I started to realize was that everywhere I looked, whether it was housing or education or religion or economics, wherever I looked, I could see where eugenics was there. And it was named as eugenics. It was actually named. And I realized this was a social movement in this country that defined the nation almost from its inception, and clearly at its crux, at its most seminal points. It absolutely did. It was defined by the American mainframe, the American trope, and our presidents from Roosevelt all the way around. they talked about eugenics and survival of the fittest and getting rid of the taint and sterilizing folks. They talked about it openly because it was just something that made the nation better. And they wanted the best nation possible. So even when we listen to this person who has the potential to become president again in November, he's always talking about racehorse theories and being fit. That he's a old school eugenicist, in my opinion. And so you just have to be extremely cautious and careful with that language because it means that others are considered human waste, and the goal is to rid society of them or to keep them from reproducing or matriculating, living well within these spaces.
Thank you. So we have a question coming from Brian. Brian writes, excellent and historically enlightening presentation, dear sister. Question, is the current gene editing / CRISPR technology a present day continuation of eugenics?
Thank you for the compliment and thank you for the question. The answer is yes. Um, Even though I talk about old school eugenic theories, eugenics is very much alive and well. Every year, the American Eugenic Society partners with the Eugenics Society, the global version, and they have an annual meeting, usually in October in London. I've been to this meeting for the last 2 years just to see what they were talking about. And yes, they're talking about gene editing. We have scientists all over the place who are trying to figure out how to increase birth rates among white women who it looks as though God just literally shut off their ability to reproduce. Or when they do reproduce, they're reproducing with non white men. And so that's become an issue across the board. Um, and so the idea now is how to get those numbers back up, and that's a global concern. How to get those white birth numbers back up, and at the same time, how to ward off certain diseases and conditions that do seem to be permeating the white genetic population. So things like breast cancer, CRISPR is looking at, and I can't remember the actual isolated code for it, but I work with a wonderful scientist named Dr. Sophia Sparks. She's on the Acumen team, and she goes into these meetings as a scientist and can sit there and hobnob with them and get to the logistics of it. And so there are a number of things in the birthing process. In some instances, there's talk about artificial wombs because most women feel like, if they're fit and they're healthy and they get pregnant, that they could potentially lose their own lives or gain weight and not be able to get the weight off. And so I want to still be beautiful and have a baby who has blue eyes, blonde hair, will not develop arthritis as they get older, will never get breast cancer, and all of the genes that I may have or the markers for those particular genes. The idea is to try and pull them out. That is absolutely a eugenic construct. Unfortunately, and fortunately, I actually say fortunately, you cannot be God at being God. You cannot create in the way you're trying to create. So there have been instances where the goal is to create a particular type of baby, and it's failed every time.
Thank you. Thank you. Um, So for everyone in the audience, we do ask if you have questions for Dr. Sherman to please post it in the Q&A box. I see some great questions coming in the chat, but I don't want to miss it. So please post it in the Q&A box so that we can make sure it gets asked. Our next question comes from Wanda. Great presentation, Dr. Sherman. As a retired teacher, how may we assist our parents in South Georgia strengthen the mindset of our kids with the necessary love, security, and safety at home, despite the home they are from? Many of our parents need help mentally, and I'm sure that question can apply throughout the U.S.
Yes. Thank you. And again, wonderful question. The goal is to meet the parents where they are. And so cultural competencies aren't just a Black person comes to another Black person's space. It is literally who within that space. And again, my parents are from rural Mississippi. All right. And I'm talking the Delta. So Duncan, Shelby, hollering out Clarksdale and places like that. All right. So still dirt roads. And the language is different. So everything becomes not me talking to you as an educator, but me talking to you as a parent, another parent, or me talking to you just as a woman. And it's like, I would say, in the same way you turn eugenics on its ear, in the same way the eugenics movement was propagated and pushed out to the masses wherever they were and whatever capacity they had, mentally, emotionally, whatever else, you bring that language down and you bring it to them. So it was fireside chats. It's the next time you have a mass picnic, a community day or something, that you have a space, not with a table set up or whatever. We just gonna sit in the grass and we're gonna have a cookout or whatever, and we're gonna literally just start having conversations about, have you thought about, we're gonna have a little class where we're gonna talk about this, or we're gonna teach this, or have you ever wanted to read this book, or that, and literally get them into a space where they feel comfortable enough trying, or admitting that they need help, admitting that they want help. But it has to be offered in a way where it doesn't make them feel like they're less than, like they're being judged. And so it's literally, I can tell you the number of times I've been in Duncan and I take my shoes off and I walk down that dirt road and I talk to the people there and I swing my arms and put the peanuts in the Coca-Cola like everybody else. And it's like, tell me what, the whole language, the mother tongue comes out. And it's, tell me what you want. Tell me what you need. Tell me what it is that you need. This is the other thing when we go into spaces, sometimes we see what we want them to have, but we need to know first and foremost what they need and what they want. And all of it can be fused together at some point, but is that basic level of respect and just compassion where it's like, tell me what you need from me. Tell me how I can help you with your granddaughter or with your son, as he's trying to learn the stuff. Tell me what you think he needs, and I think once those conversations in a very comfortable space get started, you'll have the tools that you need, because they're going to tell you what they need. They're going to tell you what they want. And it's your job to kind of figure out where your parameters are. And that's the hard part, because again, sometimes I want so much for the people around me. But I need to know from them what it is that they want and what they need in order to make sure that they're successful in what it is they're doing. And it may take 2 or 3 years where I want it to take 2 or 3 weeks because I got to work my way into their trust. And so you'll start to see it, I think, if it's done at a very, very, very grassroots level.
Wonderful. We're going to take a couple of more questions. So if you would like a question, we're going to take a few more minutes for questions. So if you would like a question to be presented to Dr. Sherman, please go ahead and get your questions in now before we close out. So our next question comes from Janice. Is there a model for starting informal learning labs? How is it different from homeschooling?
I don't know that there's necessarily, when I say informal, I mean informal. Again, just wherever you are, asking a few other folks around you, do you have a Saturday? Do you have time one Saturday a month, or um, 2 Saturdays a month for a few hours, and then just bringing the kids in? I mean, it's as informal as whoever determines and agrees to do it. Homeschooling, you can do it, that way. I think with the homeschooling, it's you're there for a longer period. You have once again a manual, or the guidelines and the rules for how you're going to teach, in order to make sure that they match up with whatever the county or the state rules and regulations are about that. I'm not necessarily talking about it in that way. I'm thinking more in terms of like the Saturday schools that, I know they've had them in London. I think they've had them a few places across America where people were teaching Black history. And it was literally like, they're not teaching Black history in schools. Okay, well, the schools have never taught Black history. If you want Black history taught, it's enough of you to understand Black history and you know a few historians or you know a few people who can speak on certain things. Get together a book list that the kids can use, divided by age groups. And some of the adults divide that by age groups. If you want to divide it by gender, so all the boys in the room, you do what you need to do to just set it up in a very, very, that's what I said. When I say informal, you get to determine what works. And when you do it that way, again, there is no failure. Really, it's just like, okay, we tried it this way. We need to tweak it a little bit. We're going to try this and we'll tweak that a little bit. This didn't work at all, so we're going to work back this way. And so you play it by ear. The goal, again, is not, we need to make sure this number of people, learn X, Y, and Z by a certain amount of time in order to hit this particular metric. It's never that. With me, even if I'm doing eugenic lectures, I always say, if one person in the room gets it, I'm good. I don't care if it was 3,000 people there. If one person in the room gets it, I've done my job. All right, I'm good. And so, again, the impact that you make simply by extending yourself, you will never understand the impact that you have on other folks who need that. And so it's just a matter of who you can get to come together with you. And if you can't find anyone initially, work it out with Zoom, work it out. There are a number of great folks here in the DC area. Anthony Tillman, he does a reading lab for children. He's in, I want to say Seat Pleasant, Maryland. I think it's Seat Pleasant, Maryland. He's in that area. But he's literally teaching 4 to 9-year-olds to read. And they're there once a week. Every now and again, he'll ask me to come in for Black History Month and talk to them. But he has volunteers that come in to sit and work with the kids and read with them. And so I'm not really sure how he does that, but it's the organization is called Make Smart Cool. Make Smart Cool. And so he's an amazing example of that. And so he just kind of out of nowhere decided this is what he wanted to do to ensure that kids could read and read properly and to start them early. The parents get to come. The school system is working with him, and the library system is working with him to give him the free space in order to set up the reading labs once a week.
Thank you. Thank you for that focus and emphasis on ways that we can empower ourselves and take agency in our own lives for what we need. Our next question comes from Gloria. Do you think COVID was a form of eugenics?
That's a good question, and I've heard it a number of times. I don't necessarily think that it was. If it really was a push for some type of genetic annihilation, it backfired. So that was one of the topics of the last eugenic conference that I attended in London in October 2023. Part of the concern was that when the dust cleared, 63.7% of all the people globally that died from COVID were white. So the people in that room were discussing how it was that the Pakistani population, the African and Jamaicans, that were all across London specifically, but all across Europe and across the world, they may have contracted COVID, but when it came to the numbers of deaths, you had that 63.7% as white, and they weren't elderly. So once again, the scientists, if they did decide to manufacture this to create an issue, Black genes did what Black genes do.
And with that, I want to lead that into the final question. which I would like for you to speak a little bit about your upcoming research or your current research on womanish and sterilization. I think that led perfectly right into that. You can speak a little bit about the current work that you're doing and also your speaking schedule, if you have
Oh,
any upcoming events.
absolutely. The work that I'm doing on womanish is a personal saga for me, because probably 20 years ago or so, I had an aunt who um, announced, or she was going to the doctors for different things, and she had a heart condition. And if you went to the doctor with her just to be with her, the doctor would always say, "Can I speak freely?" And she would say, "Yeah, they know." And I'm like, "No, what?" And so eventually it came out that she had syphilis in her blood. All right. Um, it turns out that my aunt was part of the serological um, test subjects for the syphilis study. Now, we always talk about Tuskegee, but my research shows that the syphilis tests, the studies, were done in 6 different states. All right, 6. So we talk about Alabama, but we never talk about the other 5. And my aunt in Mississippi, the idea was that if you can find Black subjects who are sharecroppers, they will not be moving from this area. And the job in Mississippi, the research in Mississippi was to inject prepubescent children, those who had not gone through puberty yet, with syphilis to determine if it would cause them to be infertile over a long period of time. So my aunt was injected with syphilis at the age of 9. One of her brothers, they were taken from the school in Duncan and taken to Greenville, which was probably 20, 30 miles away. So there was no way for my grandparents to get to them. But her brother was 11, she was 9. And just listening to her story, because both of them ended up leaving Mississippi at some point, um, they capped out of the actual experimentation, out of the study. That uncle went into the military, where eventually he ended up with taking penicillin for something. So but to inject it into the body through the blood, the goal was not for it to show up as lesions and transmittable and contractable as a venereal disease, but to determine how it would impact your blood system, your heart, your lungs, and your organs, and to see if it would automatically keep you from going through puberty and make you a workable person. You can still work on the working fields, but you would not reproduce and have children. Fortunately, and thank God for it, my aunt had 10 kids. My uncle had kids. So once again, the experimentation did not work, but um, it led me to understand how Black women's bodies, Black men's as well, but specifically Black women's bodies, as the seat of either fitness or unfitness in the minds of eugenicists, um, was a site of terror for the medical community, for this nation, for many nations. And so I wanted to be able to tell her story. So I've been able to find the documents for her and for other folks, and going into these other places, including Tennessee and Georgia. They had a serological experiment that was going there as well, and to find out from them exactly what's happened with this information. My aunt was able to um, sit down and be interviewed and give me loads and loads of information. She lived to a ripe old age of 83. Thank God for that. She was beautiful and wonderful up until the end. The syphilis in her blood did not, it hindered her heart functions by the time she reached her late 70s. Okay, so once again, it did not have the effect that I believe the eugenicists had wanted to do, or the experimenters or the study people wanted to. But this is what I mean by histories that are kind of right in front of us. There was also very quickly a law that came up in 1964 as a result of the civil rights movement that was going on in Mississippi, where it was determined that any Black female who had a child out of wedlock could be arrested and charged with a felony under an immorality clause. Charged with that felony, she was required to do a 3 to 5 year custodial sentence in the infamous Parchment prison. The only way she could get out of that 3 to 5 year incarceration would be to be sterilized, if they sterilized her, if she agreed to sterilization. And so all of these things are happening, not in a vacuum, but over the course of years. My aunt's issue, she was taken to Greenville in 1943. The issue with the civil rights movement, that was 1964. So there's a hidden history that's right out in the open, um, that we just don't know about. And so my goal with the research, I have student volunteers all over the globe, and I welcome others who are interested. I'm teaching folks how to go into the archives, go through these documents, the names, the paperwork, all the stuff is still there. There's certain rules and regulations where we cannot release people's names, and I'm happy with that. But to actually be able to see doctors write in notes, the person is feeble-minded, they're a waste. This is human waste. We don't, potential breeder, feeble-minded. These girls they were being sterilized as early as age 11, 12 years old. And so the goal is to make people aware so that they understand these things are still taking place, they're still going on. And even if we only sell 2 books, one from my mama buying and somebody else out there, you need to be able to document these stories and make these narratives come alive for the folks who live through this trauma. So womanish was a term that meant somebody was being fresh or fast. And these girls, someone just looked at them and determined they were dangerous because they were pretty, or they weren't even sexually active, but they were pretty. And they were conscripted to reformatories where they were sterilized ad hoc for quote unquote being feeble minded after being put through that battery of measurements or IQ tests. Upcoming lectures. We are pretty much on hiatus until May as we're doing the research. And then we'll start back with the weekly Pop U series, which is Popular Eugenics in Television and Film. We're telling you that what you're watching on television is impacting how you see the world around you, and it's definitely in eugenic frames. We'll also be in London every October for the entire month for their Black History Month. But we're always looking to come and speak to people. So please check our website. And if you want us, we'll definitely make aims to be there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. Again, everyone in the chat is just really thankful for the great information that you have provided. So
Thank you. Thank you.
yes. So for the family out there, we do want to invite you out to our upcoming Wisdom Wednesday, which will be next month, April 17th. We will have Dr. Abena Brown El-Halali speaking on Black women and mental health. So definitely want to make sure you're there to continue this conversation and this knowledge. Thank you so much, Dr. Sherman, for such a really fantastic, well-informed, well-presented presentation, so knowledgeable, so much information. And thank you for making those connections for us in terms of the historical impact of the eugenics program that is still impacting us today. And it's very important for us to know about that. And we would love to definitely have you back out once you complete Womanish, perhaps to share more information with that about those stories. So before we finally close out, I would like to turn it back over to you for any final closing remarks.
Thank you. And I absolutely appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. I'm I feel blessed and honored. And I guess if there's anything that I can leave you with is just, we use the slogan onward, upward, always. It's never too late to start researching and learning. We are a very informal space, and I want to see you all not just in lectures, but I want to see you in the archives. I want you to be able to to live fully and wholly, understanding what's around you. So forewarned is forearmed, but it's like what you're armed with is knowledge and understanding. And once you have that, it serves as a healing balm, to those around you and those who have to come up behind you, to know that you cared enough, to turn off the TVs and the radios and all of that, and really go back into these libraries and these archives, and into, your parents or grandparents' notes and diaries and whatever else, to pull those stories out and again reconnect, to make us as a people whole again, and whole within your families and within yourselves. So again, I welcome questions from you all. If you didn't get your questions in tonight, you have my email address there. I'm not a person who tells you, email me and then someone else sends you a message and you get these little standard you know cut and paste responses to things. I want to engage with you, and that's why I do this as a public historian rather than being at a university, because I want to talk to everyday people. So please don't let that opportunity slide by you. And I look forward to seeing you guys and speaking with you often.
Wonderful. Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. And we look forward to seeing you next month. Again, for more information about IKG, you may go to ikgculturalresourcecenter.com. And before we close out, I will be placing back in the chat the link to purchase Egypt on the Potomac tickets. If you are interested, sorry, my screen went away there. Egypt on the Potomac tickets, I'm putting that back in the chat for you all. And again, Dr. Shantella Sherman, www.theacumengroup.org. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Peace.